Hello everybody, if it's your first time with us today, welcome, and if you've been here before, welcome back. Today we're continuing our series on beginner strategy, and what we're looking at today is pawn structure. We're going to talk about different things that can happen, different ways that the pawns might be formulated, maybe placed, and what the advantages and weaknesses are of these different pawn structures. How can we use that early on to get an edge? What should or shouldn't we be afraid of? And what effect is it going to have on the endgame? The first concept I'm going to talk about is the concept of pawn islands. So the position that we have right now is an endgame position. You can see that both sides have just the king and the rook with a few pawns left on the board. The material is roughly equal for the moment. White has 5 pawns, and black also has 5 pawns, the king and the rook. So, what's going on here? Let's go ahead and take a look. Well, white has 5 pawns, but he has 3 connected here over on the king side, and 2 connected on the queen side. The pawns work best when they have the ability to support each other. You can see the pawn on a3 supports the one on b4, f2 supports g3, and this guy over here on h3, while he's not supported by another pawn, he could move up and be supported here, or the g-pawn could move up and he can support him there. So we have options. The pawns together have flexibility and the ability to work well when they're connected. However, black's pawns are slightly less so. He has 3 sets of pawns. He's got the pawns on a6 and b5, d5 and e6, and a lone pawn over here on g6. The groups of pawns when they're connected are what we refer to as pawn islands. So in this position, white has 2 pawn islands, and black has 3 pawn islands. Now, in general, the rule of thumb is that the less pawn islands we have, the fewer pawn islands, the better, because the more connected our pawns are, the better they work together. And the more pawn islands we have, the worse it becomes for us, because there's more weaknesses. It's easier to attack. For example, in white's position, his weakest pawns would be a3 and f2. Of course, right now, these are both supported by the rook and the king, but those are the pawns which no other pawns are going to be able to protect. They're all in front of them already. But what about black's position? Well, he has 3 what we would call backward pawns, pawns which have already had all of their buddies to the left and right of them move forward or disappear. So these 3 pawns will never be able to be defended by another pawn in the game. This creates a weakness. So for white here, his goal is going to be to target these weaknesses. In this position, he has a very easy way to do that. You may have been looking at this. White to move, what's the best move here? Well, it's going to be rook to c6. And already white is attacking 2 of those weaknesses. Those pawn islands don't support each other very well, and it's going to be very difficult for black to defend this position. He's already going to be losing a pawn, and white should go on to win this game. So that's the concept of pawn islands. The more there are, the more targets that are going to be available. Let's go ahead and look at our next position. The next concept we're going to talk about is that of doubled pawns. Doubled pawns are pawns which are on the same file together. So, for example, white has doubled pawns here on b5 and b4 on these squares over here. Now, doubled pawns present some potential difficulties in the endgame. The problem with double pawns is that they can very easily be stopped. In their quest to move up the board and make a queen, it's easy to blockade them with less pawns. So for example, black only has 2 pawns here and white has 3 on the queen side, but black has a way that he can stop white's pawns dead in his tracks. If it's black to move, what move can he play that will make sure that the white pawns never can create a passer and make a queen? Well, black would like to play b6 here if he's going to blockade. So which pawn should he move here? He had the option either b6 or a6. Well, to blockade, black's going to move the pawn that's in front of the doubled ones. Why is that? Well, there's 2 options here. One is white can push past, he can play a6, and then you can see there's nowhere for these pawns to go. They're totally locked and blockaded. His other option would be to take, play a takes b6, and then after a takes b6, once again, it's totally locked up. But what happens if black were to play the other move, if black played a6? Well, in this position, white can take the pawn on a6, and after black recaptures, even though this pawn is backwards, white now has the option of sacrificing that pawn, and if black takes it, then white has a passer on the a file. So the best way to blockade doubled pawns is going to be to push the pawn in front of the doubled pawn. That's going to lock them in place. Now, another thing to note is black doesn't even have to do that. Black can sit around and make a waiting move. He could maybe play g4 in order to create a passer on the king side, and white still does not have the ability to create a passed pawn on the queen side. Let's look at what white's two tries are. Well, if white plays a6, we can simply lock it up. We can play b6, and now they're blockaded and stuck. And what happens if white plays b6? Now, we're going to go ahead and capture. A takes b6. White has two options. If he takes, sure, he has one more pawn move he can make, but once again, they're locked up and no passer. And his other option of playing a6 is just going to be another pawn sacrifice, and now we're the ones who are going to make a pass pawn on the queen side rather than white. So the problem with doubled pawns is that in the endgame, even when you have a majority where you have doubled pawns, they can't create a passer on their own against two or the same number in front of them, so it can create a little bit of a problem there. However, doubled pawns are not necessarily all bad news, so let's go ahead and look earlier on in the opening. This position is one where white is really honing in on black's knights. Black's knight is pinned to the queen, his other knight is pinned to the rook, and we're looking at how doubled pawns may or may not affect this position. There's one sort of good set and one sort of potentially bad set, and let's talk about what could happen here. For one, white has the option of playing the move bishop takes on c6 here. If he does that and captures this knight, then black can play pawn b takes c6. This is not really that bad for black. Yes, he has doubled pawns, but in this case, the pawn is moving toward the center. If we can capture with our pawns toward the center, it gives us a little bit more control over those squares we care about, right? Those ones we want to fight for in the opening. And that can be an advantage to us. So simply doubling your opponent's pawns is not always a good objective to have. Maybe it can help in an endgame, but you've got a lot of chess to play even to get there. In this case, you've let go of some control. You had a nice pin on the knight couldn't move before, and so by taking that knight, you then relieve some of the pressure on the opponent's position. However, let's look at the other capture here. What about this knight? Well, if we capture this knight with the bishop, once again, black has the option of taking with the pawn here, and black has doubled pawns a second time. Like we mentioned, black is taking toward the center, so he gets a little bit more central control. That's actually potentially a good thing for him. But here the difference is this pawn was playing a nice role in front of his king. Now we've managed to double his pawns, and it's less the fact that black has doubled pawns, which is the weakness, and more the fact that we've messed up the structure of his pawns in front of the king. Now potentially we can play moves like maybe knight h5 to f5. We can bring our queen into the king side. Maybe we'll even play f4, get our rook into the attack. White is going to have a very big attack against black's king coming in the coming moves after we've doubled the pawns over here. So when we're looking at whether or not doubling our opponent's pawns is a good idea, those are things we want to consider. Well, are we just letting him get some more central control? If that's the case, we don't need to worry so much about rushing to double their pawns. But can we really create some other weaknesses? Are we causing weaknesses around his king? Maybe we can get an attack out of it. In that case, we do want to do it. The moral of the story is that doubled pawns can be both good and bad. We don't want to put them into a box. We don't want to always say it's good to have doubled pawns. We don't want to always say it's bad to have doubled pawns. We need to think about what else is going on in the position. Now, the last sort of structure we want to look at is that of what we call an isolated pawn. So we've talked about pawn islands, and we've talked about doubled pawns. What's an isolated pawn? An isolated pawn is a pawn which no longer has buddies on the left or right of it, so it can't be supported by another. For example, black's pawn on d5 is isolated. He has no more pawns on the e or c file, and thus it cannot be supported. It also makes the square in front of the pawn a very nice outpost for the opponent's pieces. Why is that? Well, an outpost, if you recall, is a square which cannot be attacked by an opponent's pawn. So with no pawns on the e or c file for black, if white were to put a knight here on d4, black can attack it with other pieces, but he can never push it off of that square with a pawn. In isolated pawn positions, the squares in front of the isolated pawn become very important. So you can see in this game, white is really fighting for that d4 square. He has a rook fighting for the square, his queen is fighting for the square, his knight's fighting for the square, he's got a pawn on c3 fighting for the square, and black is trying to do the same. He has a knight contesting it, he has a queen putting pressure on that square. Maybe he'll even play a rook to e4 to try to put some more pressure on that square. Lots of ideas centering around fighting for this d4 square. Now, with that being said, black has some advantages as well. He has the isolated pawn, but you'll notice he has a very nice rook on the e-file. So if you have an isolated pawn, the key to playing with the isolated pawn is to get those pieces active. You want to put your rooks on the files next to that pawn, make sure you're putting pressure on the opponent's position. You also want to fight for that square in front of the pawn, the crucial one that we talked about. But you want to make sure your pieces are getting active. So what other ideas could black have? Well, maybe rook e4 like we said, maybe bishop c4 putting pressure on the diagonal. The key is that black wants to stay very active with his pieces, because if he is passive, this isolated pawn will be a very big target. White will continue to target it, blockade the square in front of it, and ultimately be able to win it later in the game, and that could be the decisive moment. So isolated pawns have very big drawbacks, but also potential advantages to them. Important thing to remember with that, if you have one, get active, start creating threats all over the board, move your pieces places where they can start causing trouble for your opponent. And if you're playing against the isolated pawn, control that square in front of it. If your opponent can push to that square, if black could play d4 here, suddenly his isolated pawn might not be that big a problem. If he can simply trade it off, then the position just becomes equal. So if you're playing against it, you really want to blockade against that isolated pawn. Put a minor piece there ideally if you can, but also make sure you're watching your own defensive resources, because remember, your opponent may be coming after you fast. So those are the general rules of pawn structure. Those are some general things to be looking for. Remember, pawn islands, the more there are, the more targets there are. In this case, black has 3 pawn islands, whereas white only has 2, so that's a nice thing for white versus black. Doubled pawns, always taking into consideration what else is happening in the position. If we can cause weaknesses, sure, they're nice to create, but sometimes they're not so bad. Sometimes they help us to fight for the center. They do, however, have drawbacks in the endgame. It's harder to make that passed pawn, and they're easier to blockade against. And then the isolated pawns, lastly. If you have the isolated pawn, get active, start creating threats across the board, and if you're playing against it, blockade it, and ultimately win it. If you've got any questions, be sure to leave them in the comment section below, and I hope you the best of luck with using those pawns in your games to come.